Hello and welcome back to Beyond the To-Do List, a podcast about productivity. I'm your host, Eric Fisher, and I'm excited to welcome back to the show Oliver Burkeman. This time we're talking about his new book, Meditations for Mortals: 4 weeks to embrace your limitations and make time for what counts. Oliver's a journalist and an author, best known for his book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. This conversation continues that through line from 4,000 Weeks, bridging the gap, focusing on action and the gap between knowing and doing. We're also talking about the illusion of control versus agency and why often we seek control over our lives and how accepting our limitations can actually increase our capacity for choosing meaningful action. We also talk about breaking free from productivity debt and how many of us start each day feeling behind and what we can do to change that mindset. We're also talking about the value of small decisions and next steps and how making peace with uncertainty and taking that next available action can lead to lasting change. If you're a fan of Oliver's like I am, you know that his insights will challenge the way you think about productivity, time management, and how to make space for what truly matters, and that you're going to enjoy this conversation with Oliver Burkeman. Well, it is my privilege to welcome back to the show Oliver Burkeman. Oliver, welcome back to Beyond the To-Do List.
Thank you for having me back.
I knew I had to have you back. I mean, it was a privilege to have you on the first time because so many people liked and loved that first book, 4,000 Weeks. And I think we should do a quick hey, what's that about before we transition over to this new one, Meditations for Mortals. I think a lot of people first read that as Meditation for Mortals. I know I did. Then I said, and I thought, that's a cool next chapter for Oliver to write about. And then I was like, it's not about that. His approach to meditation would be interesting, but that's not what this is. But it's Meditations for Mortals, 4 weeks to embrace your limitations and make time for what counts. And honestly, that is, in a sense, what the first book was about. So what's the throughput here? What's the through line, I should say? Let's synopsize that first book real quick and then transition to, okay, what's this next chapter in this dialogue for you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess 4,000 Weeks, that title refers to the average life expectancy in the developed world. And it's really a book about taking seriously the fact that we're finite when it comes to how we think about our time and how we spend our days. Not in a desperately trying to scare the reader into doing extraordinary things way, but more in the sense of how it really can change the fabric, the texture of the day-to-day in a positive direction if you sort of take account of the fact that we have such limited time and such limited control over that time. So the subtitle of that book is Time Management for Mortals. And I don't know, it amused me to combine what feels like a very sort of narrow idea, time management, with such a sort of existential one as being mortal. And I'm making the case that time management is not a narrow concern. It's sort of the question of how we live out our finite lives on the planet. I guess you could say that is ultimately a sort of a philosophical book. It's a kind of, I'm trying to lead people into a perspective shift that has meant a lot to me about trying to explain why I think it's both relaxing and empowering to really stare finitude in the face instead of what we usually do, which is find all sorts of ways to try not to acknowledge it. So, I mean, to move on to this new book, Meditations for Mortals, and yes, I am running into some issues there with the title. What I've been saying is that the person who I'm sort of arrogantly taking the mantle from here is not Buddha, but Marcus Aurelius, whose original Meditations is pretty well known as a sequence of thoughts to reflect upon in a hopefully edifying and enlightening way. The theme here is still the fact that we're finite. Maybe that's going to be my theme forever. What I wanted to do differently here, and you certainly don't need to have read one book to read the other, I don't think. I really wanted to focus this time around on what seemed to me to be a missing piece, which is it's all very well to know how you would want to spend your life and to have a sense of how you want to show up in the world as a finite human or as anybody, but it's a very different thing to actually do it, right? To come over that gap from knowing to doing. And I wanted to write a book that was really specifically focused on action and on what it means to take action and how to take action in hopefully a sort of different and interesting way, not a kind of old school motivational, just shout at people until they guiltily take a bit of action for a few weeks and then give up. And I'm also, the format and the structure of the book is intended to sort of
I was going to get to that. Yes, I thought that was a unique piece that differentiates it from the first one. If the first one is philosophical, this one doesn't eschew the philosophical approach, but adds a practical layer to it where it's a 4-week journey. It's daily meditations that take you through that productivity. I dare to say productivity advice. It's not necessarily that, but it's this concept of sitting with imperfectionism and allowing the process of letting go of the illusion of control over many different things, time and expectations and outcome and people and ourselves and all of that. It's almost like a workshop over the course of a month.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is not compulsory to read it 1 chapter per day for 28 days, but that's how it's divided up into 4 weeks. They're short chapters. You can easily do it. Something that I have really concluded from my own experience and from talking to other people and reading and everything is that the really practical thing when it comes to making personal change, getting around to more of the things that really matter, actually, the perspective shift is the really practical thing. And the things that are techniques and tools and methods and that feel very practical are often totally useless if they're not accompanied by a kind of deeper perspective shift. So what I'm trying to do here is kind of help that perspective shift take root by, like, igniting little thought bombs day to day for a month, if I'm successful. It's not for me to say. And then, sure, offering techniques, offering ways you can bring this into reality, to take action, to sort of let action happen, which I think is a really important part of it. Maybe we can talk about. So I really wanted to kind of square the circle between, well, I want this book to be practical, but I don't think giving people a list of steps they need to implement is actually the most effective way to be practical. I think the most effective way is to find a way to let this kind of perspective shift get under their skin a little bit. And that is what has always worked for me as well.
You mentioned dropping bombs and exploding things. Like, what's the target here? What are you exploding? What are you blowing up?
I guess if I'm aiming myself against something, then it is a certain kind of attitude towards life that I think is very, very widespread. It has certainly plagued me for a very long time. It takes many different forms, but it has at its root this idea that we're going to get to some point in our lives later, maybe very soon, maybe a long time later, when we're finally sort of on top of things. We have everything under control. We know what we're doing at last. We don't feel like we're completely winging it. We don't feel like we're totally overwhelmed. We're sort of in the driver's seat of our lives at last. And then it's all, well, I wouldn't say plain sailing, but if it's a driver's seat, it should be
smooth sailing.
Control.
Yeah, right. It works too.
I think this is a very understandable idea. I think it manifests itself in all sorts of different forms. But I think it's sort of fundamentally flawed because it is basically an exercise in avoidance of the truth that the kind of control we want when we're pursuing that kind of fantasy is a kind of control that finite humans just don't get to have, right? Because we live in a world, and we always have, but we especially do now, when there is just far more that you could usefully do than you will ever get to do. There's sort of endemic uncertainty. It's impossible to really feel confident about what the future holds. Goodness knows, right now in the news, that seems truer than ever. The idea that you're going to get a handle on everything, understand everything, have all the systems in your life working smoothly, know what you're doing, and then the real meaning of life is going to kick in. That is a sort of a tragic way to live, ultimately, because it means that you postpone all that stuff to a time that never arrives, instead of kind of plunging into it now. Even though there's a kind of a defeat involved here, it involves letting go of a very comforting illusion. I don't think the result is depressing, and I don't think it's sort of passive either. It's not about just check out and, meditate until you just sort of float around doing nothing. It's a real help, and it has been for me, in actually getting stuck into action here and now. And that's the stance that I call imperfectionism in the book, the idea that allowing ourselves to do things badly and in the state of total uncertainty and without knowing if we're going to be able to do them consistently for the rest of our lives, that's what actually can enable us to do them in reality.
Well, and you reference that in kind of a metaphorical way when you talk about kayaks and super yachts and the difference between that, where the super yacht, like you just said earlier, that's the sailing, that's the cruise control, but the kayak is different. You don't sit in a kayak and just let yourself drift. You still have to take action.
Right, exactly. I'm very fond of this image. I don't know if it helps everybody, but, being human in the world is like being in a kayak to this extent, right? You don't really know what's coming. You can't be certain when the rough patches and the quiet patches are coming. You're absolutely, as you say, right? You're not being carried along in a sort of raft with no capacity to steer. You can act, but the way you act is by taking the next action that seems wise and the next, as opposed to this sort of image of a super yacht where you kind of program the whole route into the computer and then sit back and it all sort of executes predictably. The other thing, of course, is that being in a kayak is kind of exhilarating and it's very vulnerable. Bad things could happen. This is also true of every moment of human existence. But the sort of reward for being open to that vulnerability is it's also thrilling and exciting and you feel alive. One of the things I'm charting through these chapters as well is this idea that actually even when we succeed in gaining a certain high degree of control over our lives, we kind of fail because it turns out that what that does is to sort of squeeze the vibrancy out of life. And I think, many of us have that experience of either feeling out of control or then you get in control and it's like, oh, but something is lacking here.
And I think that vibrancy or the kind of rattling against that is one of the things that when people come to start to speak about, think about, put into plans about productivity systems or tips or tricks or whatever you want to call it, when they start to head towards that, I need to be more productive in this area type dialogue internally or with others, they come to it with this baggage of, and you refer to it as starting each day in productivity debt that they need to pay off. And that's not only is that not fun and starts the day horrible, but it sets you up for failure and this weight that you're struggling underneath, and it kills your self-worth as well.
Yeah. I think there's absolutely 100%. And I think there's a really interesting thing here, which is that it's almost kind of a partially religious motivation, right? It's the idea to kind of that these things are that if you can just get on top of everything or just find the right system to follow, it would sort of save you in a pretty deep and fundamental way. So we sort of, pick up a new productivity book at the airport or find a new app or come up with some new, very, very firm resolution to put more willpower into this than we've ever managed to put before. And for a moment, it's exciting because you think like, okay, I'm on the path now. As you say, you can't win that game because like nothing can save you from the situation of being a finite human, vulnerable, uncertain, limited energy, limited time. Secondly, because the input, other way of saying the same thing, is like the things you could get your arms around are infinite. So even if you manage to do 10 times as many things as you used to, you're not going to feel like you've done all the things. And something that I've found really interesting actually is that I used to throw myself at all these productivity techniques with this kind of, with all the desperation of a seeker of salvation. I wouldn't have put it like that to myself at the time. And then they all go wrong. And then I start hating on them and I start saying like, well, the Pomodoro technique, it's useless because it doesn't work like this. Once you somewhat go through the process that I've gone through and try to help people through in these books of being like, well, there is no salvation from finitude, but that's okay, right? It's not actually a problem to be fully who we are, more fully who we are. Those old techniques turn out to be perfectly useful in a kind of a modest way. There's nothing wrong with the Pomodoro technique. There's nothing wrong with getting things done. These things are all totally fine if the spirit in which you come at them is, I'm a finite human and here are some tools in my toolbox, instead of like, this is the thing that's going to enable me to escape the human condition.
Yes. Well, and I think that's the thing too that I would say is coming at it from the perspective of I need to pick tools versus before that point, you don't just go and pick up tools from a tool bunch and say, okay, I have everything I need before saying, what's the job? Like,
Right.
you got to know what it is you're going to be doing first. And I think even before the what you're going to be doing comes the who am I going to be? And kind of saying, okay, I'm in this world. It's got, and you talk about this, like the river versus the bucket approach, where, there's a river of constant information all around us. You alluded to the news earlier and how it's more constant than ever now. I recently did a week-long social media fast in January. I deleted the apps from my phone, didn't touch it on my laptop or desktop screen attached to it. That was liberating. It didn't cure anything or fix any problem, but it did lower my heart rate, lower my stress level, helped me become more aware of how much more like that I want my life to be like. And then and again, going back to what I just said, what's the job of those tools and which of them do I want to use and which of them do I think, now that I've come back to them, and I'm not going to name names, but there's one that starts with an F that I think is utterly crap. So.
I think it's really interesting. Cal Newport, who so many of whose ideas sort of resonate with me and our subject matter overlaps to some extent, has written about this, what he describes as the Amish approach to technology, whereby, we think, or maybe you don't, but I would sort of stereotypically think of the Amish as people who just completely shun technology. And it turns out that if you look into this, it's actually not the right story. The right story is that they have a social norm of assessing whether a new technology is something that serves the needs and goals of their community, and they introduce it. If it does, and they don't drive cars, but you'll find lumber mills operated by Amish firms where they use precision computers because that's the right way to do that work. And it's that whole notion of like, we are knowledge work craftspeople, not to get too pretentious about it. We have our tool sets, and nobody in a full-time carpenter would never say like, it's only the jigsaw from now on. This is my one tool. And every single thing I do, I'm going to make sure that I use that one tool. You pick up the tool that's right for the job at that moment. And it's so liberating because actually, and same with social media, right? I mean, this is a big struggle because of how they're designed, and I struggle with myself. It's much easier to be totally addicted, and then it's sort of second most easy to be completely renouncing, and then to use it in a way that is helpful for your own goals is the big challenge, because that's not what the social media platforms want. But at least having that concept in mind, I think is really helpful. You're in charge of your life in some sense, and you pick the tools that help, as opposed to, if I can only find the philosophy that would sort of live life for me, then I wouldn't have to take responsibility, and I could just, follow the system and it would all happen automatically.
Yeah, it's kind of this paradox, I think, when I'm going through the last book and this one, of you have no control, and yet you have way more control than you acknowledge most of the time. And it's that kind of balance between those two things. It's the acknowledging of the one and the accepting of the other, and you can choose which one of those is which, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I end up using, I never quite have settled on the language here, but I tend to talk about control as the kind of absolute thing that we can't have, and then something like agency.
I was just going to say agency. I was like control versus agency. Yeah.
There's something else, which is what we can have. And it's not actually a question even of just saying like, you got to tone down your goal from control to agency. It's actually something more like you can only really have agency once you're willing to surrender,
let go of control,
the quest for control. I mean, it's really endlessly fascinating to me. Yeah.
And that's the thing. I mean, one of the things that I noticed, just to go back to the social media thing real quick here, was I noticed that it felt, I think I'm going to do a solo episode. Actually, I know I am. I am going to do a solo episode on that social media fast and just kind of walk through what it was I did, why I decided to do it, things I learned from it, and steps I've taken since then, and the next round that I'm going to do, and kind of my iteration on the thoughts of that. But one of the observations I noticed that ties in here to this conversation was that the apps are, whether you're on desktop or not, the apps are designed to hook you. and based on what they show you and when they show you and how they show you, and to engage and get the endorphins and all that kind of, we've heard all this before, but it ties in here because it hooks you in a way that gets you to have a response, a knee-jerk response, especially like, oh, I either love what that is, or I absolutely am against what that person or that I am for or against. We use the word polarizing a lot these days, and I don't believe that to be as entirely true, but I do believe that it exerts itself or exhibits itself more so when we have this distance between us, when there's not a face-to-face person in front of us, and we can just fire off a reaction by tapping something quickly and easily that is non-committal, but feels like we're pounding our hand, like, or pumping our fist. Yeah, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it leads to all, I think you're completely right about the sort of disembodied aspect of this. Really difficult to say that to somebody like in a coffee shop in the flesh. And the other thing that happens is that it sort of systematically focuses to some extent on small differences, right? And not that there are not big differences in things like the American political situation at the moment, as well as small ones, but you end up kind of hating the person who you think of as having drifted away from your tribe's views much more than you might hate, some mass murderer or somebody who's clearly done something more morally bad by any normal judgment. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's not good. I'm not quite willing to say like that there's no way to engage with these platforms that resist that. I'm very much not in favor of saying like, it's your responsibility, just use willpower. That is unfair given the situation. But, there are lots of equally awful things to be said about junk food, and it is possible, I think, to occasionally enjoy that. And maybe some people can and some people can't, and it's a sort of addiction issue in that sense too. But there are lots of things in life where if we used them all the time, it would be really bad. And they're very conducive to that, but we manage not to, Many people are moderate drinkers and things like that. So I hope that there's some way we can come to this with social media, but I haven't got there yet.
And I think that's where I'm going. And I'm glad you brought up some other subject that also applies to a lot of things, actually. But it's like you immerse yourself in it so much that it starts to permeate, or better yet, saturate you into thinking, feeling that's the only way. And so that's where when we go to the productivity space, and it's like, I must milk and carpe diem every minute, moment, second of every 4,000, the weeks that I have, and et cetera, like you've, alliterated well before. And it's this idea of letting that go. Like that was one of the tastes that I got from taking that week and having this, I'm not, and it wasn't that bad, but I don't know if I'm exaggerating or not. But me not picking up I picked the phone up way less too, because those apps just weren't on there. They were like, there was just no need. And it took a day and a half, 2 days for me to get to that point of, I would pick it up and then I'd say, what was I gonna, that's not, okay. And put it back down and kind of catch myself. And it's that kind of catching yourself that I feel is kind of what we're talking about here when it comes to this control versus agency thing. It was, okay, I am mortal and I do not have control over everything, but what do I want, and what kayak strokes do I need to take, or could I take now instead of passively laying back on my super yacht, so to speak?
I love that, because it really does bring the focus back to that moment to moment decision, or almost sort of stance on life. Because of course, in certain corners of hustle culture, grind culture, whatever you want to call it, that there are people you can go just as far in the direction of like, okay, I'm just going to relentlessly focus on the thing that matters and shut everything else out. That has its own quest for an unrealistic kind of control. There are sort of hazards on both sides of this, sort of giving in completely to the sort of addictive properties of social media, or becoming the kind of person who thinks, if I just decide something strongly enough, I ought to be able to set my life on this course. And it isn't either of those things. It is that working that muscle of, right now I could do something different.
Yeah. And one of the things I want to mention is I like that each of the 4 weeks in the book has a different theme. And so you kind of, the first week is kind of all like, that kind of is where the carrying over from the first book philosophically is. But then week 2, I love that you get into this action taking kind of modality or dialogue, I guess. And that in this is again, I can't help but think of this when I think of social media, that one of the things that you talk about is we waste a lot of time avoiding decisions. And so whenever a decision, this is what I noticed, one of the other observations is, oh, I have a decision to make. Oh, well, picks up phone, scroll. I'm avoiding any decision because I'd rather have the guise of, well, let me take a, air quotes, break right now before I tackle that decision.
Yeah, completely. It's like each decision, however small, is a little encounter with being finite, right? Because you're going to take a decision and the other one is going to be gone. Even in contexts where you can change your mind again, something is gone because you're moving into the next moment of time. Other contexts in which we reach for our distractions have the same thing applies, right? If when you're struggling with a piece of difficult work that you're trying to do, maybe it's not a decision, although you could frame it as decisions, but like if you can't figure out like how to write the next sentence in a piece of writing, wonderfully tempting to slide off into social media. Or the other main time in which I sort of encounter this is boredom, when you're just sort of, when it feels like really bad that you've just got to be stuck where you are in a line or a delayed train or something. And even, you see, I've been getting less bad at this myself, but you see people hanging out at playgrounds with their kids, right? They're just scrolling on their phones because there's something that strikes them as boring about that moment. And again, I think what that is a moment where you're not getting to control the speed at which things unfold. You're just having to be there and be on other people's agendas and be on reality's agenda. And again, that's a confrontation with finitude. Okay, let's go to social media. The fascinating thing to me about all of this is that when you find a way, as you did with your social media fast, like when you find a way to just, gently encourage yourself to go through that unpleasantness of making a decision or writing the next sentence or just being present on the delayed train, 99% of the time, it's not horrible. It's unpleasurable. It would be nice to not have to feel it, but it's a really modest kind of discomfort that you can easily cope with. And yet we will end up wasting hours of a day to avoid feeling it.
Yeah, it's minor, temporary inconvenience, and we inflate that to torture.
Right. And,
I'm starving instead of slightly hungry.
Right. And if I wanted to get kind of philosophical, or maybe it's even sort of psychoanalytic about it, I would say the reason we inflate that is because it is a tiny little encounter with our mortality. That is a genuinely big deal for human beings.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
One of the things that I also noticed, instead of picking up the phone as much, I know I'm beating a dead horse here going back to this, but it's the practical living out of this was I noticed that instead of picking up the phone, then it was a matter of, okay, what's one next small action on something? And I started to keep a list of, the David Allen has the 2-minute rule where it's like, and I started to keep a list of I kind of broadened it past 2 minutes because technically we don't know if it's 2 minutes. We're estimating. Yeah. And that's totally fine. Let's hold those reins a little looser here. But I would say anything in the 2 to 10 minute range. If it felt like somewhere I could pick something up, and then the time that I would have picked up and been scrolling could have checked something off, what's that list? And it can be a long list, but it can be in those moments. Instead, so I started to pull that list out. And I did it analog. Like I had it on a mini legal pad to stay off digital tools instead of picking that phone up. Instead of going into a phone for a different app than social, stay off the phone completely. And I started to then see those things and I'd say, oh yeah, that one. Well, let's see if we can do that in less than 5 minutes. Yeah. And invariably it would happen. I would check it off. And it was so things I wasn't like, because I was trying to get it done in a certain amount of time, I wasn't thinking and that's got its own pressure, but I wasn't trying to get it perfect, just done. And by getting those things done, started to gain more momentum and felt lighter and freer and all the good, happy, fun thoughts.
Right. Yeah, no, totally. I've had that experience in sort of not totally unrelated context. And it's the sort of the horror or the sort of dislike of the idea of not doing it perfectly will instantly send you off into social media distractions. But if you've put something in place where, you don't want to ruin your whole plan for the week's fast by giving in, there's a little bit of counter pressure going on there, then you sort of step into that next moment and do the thing. And you were never going to do it perfectly to begin with. Nobody expects anyone to do anything perfectly. And, life continues, and gets deeper.
One of the other things I noticed was there were things that I had, let's use the word procrastinated on, hadn't done, but knew again, productivity debt, knew I needed to do or wanted to do for a while. But because I hadn't started it at all, I thought that it was going to take hours. And so in one of those moments, I say, okay, what's that first step on that thing? Like, what's that 2 to 10 minute thing that kickstarts that, kind of gives you a little bit of a feel around of it to see how long the rest of it past that first step is going to take. And what's funny is there were things that I thought were going to take hours, and I got them done, all of it, in about 10, 15, like I get to that 10-minute mark and be like, this is almost done. 5 more minutes. And this is this 3-hour, 2-hour thing is done. What? Crazy.
No, I think it's, and also, at that point, you probably invested several hours just thinking about how stressful it's going to be. This reminds me of something that I do mention in the new book, which comes from a Dutch Zen guy called Paul Lumens, who has this approach. He's got a whole set of fascinating insights into time management, but the one I'm focusing on here, he talks about how when there are things that we've been avoiding doing, one way of thinking about that is that we're trying to sort of deny the fact that they are a part of our reality or that we have any kind of relationship with them, which is why, if you're worried that your bank balance might be too low, you'd don't check it at the ATM, because it's like it allows you to can carry on pretending that this isn't a real issue when it actually might be a real issue if you don't know how much money you have. And all we need to do, he points out then, is to do anything at all that forges a relationship with that activity. Even visualizing, which I've been down on in general in previous writings of mine, but even just thinking about, I would go to the ATM and I would press check balance, or and I would call up the doctor and I'd get this strange pain that I've been avoiding thinking about. I'd make an appointment. Just that level of thinking can suddenly open up the way to doing it in half an hour instead of 5 hours or whatever, because you're just no longer investing all this energy in trying to pretend that this isn't part of your reality. It is. And so now you take the next step, and almost always that's going to be pretty clear what that next step should be. Yeah.
We often are, and you say this, we often make things harder than they need to be. And part of that is psychological and this baggage that we bring to it. But the other part is we avoid, and then we don't engage. And then when we do engage, like I said, once I engaged with those things, I said, I'm just going to do that bare minimum first thing that's going to give me more understanding. I'm going to let's figure out how big this iceberg is from the tip of it. And once I realized, the iceberg's all melted now because of the little bit of thing I did. And and it wasn't that it just happened once. It's that it happened multiple times consistently over that week. And then in subsequent weeks that I realized, much like the iceberg, it was melting and eroding my sort of default procrastination muscle. Now it's far from cured, and I don't think it won't be, but in a lot of ways, getting some of that momentum to just bust through these things, it's such a different place to be in than I was.
Yeah. And you're reminded of your own agency in each time. Yeah, absolutely. You reinforce that to yourself. Totally.
Yeah. So, and I think the other thing is, you kind of talk a little bit about setting goals and the difference between how somebody who, again, from that would set a goal from that productivity debt standpoint, that perspective, versus this newer, you've accepted what control you don't have, and you've also acknowledged the agency that you do have. Talk about that a little bit. Like, what's the difference there between goals, between people setting them for those two types of people?
Well, again, the deep down answer to that is that in one case, the goal behind the goals is total control, is feeling totally dominant over life and finally being able to relax. And then in the other case, the sort of more modesty, what I would call the imperfectionistic approach, is the one that sees a goal as just another useful tool to get you in the right direction onto the next step. So one example I give of that is how useful it can be to set a quantity goal rather than a quality goal in certain cases. There can be a lot to be said, to pick the obvious example for me anyway, of writing, in having a daily word count goal or a daily amount of time spent goal, because it shifts the focus away from the question of writing the best thing you possibly can or anything like that. And this is something that I mentioned in 4,000 Weeks also, but being willing to step away when the goal is met, like even if you're on a roll, even if you have momentum. But this is a very interesting thing that, if you don't face any problems with this, then I'm not telling you to, refuse to do more work. Fine, if it's all working for you. But if it isn't, to decide to write or whatever the thing might be for less time than you think you need. So, for an hour, even if you think you need 4 hours or whatever, do what you can in that time, and then really make it part of the practice to get up and walk away and deal with that sort of tide of discomfort that comes up about like, no, maybe I should stick with it because then maybe I could get it finished. And in a way, this is manifested also in this suggestion that you might read this book, 1 chapter a day, because I kind of imagine, and I know from talking to some people that it's not totally inaccurate, people like me, they get a book that seems to suggest that it's going to help them do some stuff they want to do. The absolute instinct is to just gobble it all down instantly and then know it all and then put it all into practice. And there's something really beneficial if you can bring yourself to do it in just portioning it out, doing a little chapter, stopping, sort of obliging yourself to let that chapter sort of permeate into you a little bit before you move on to the next thing. So tempting to rush ahead. And it's kind of culturally celebrated, right? Because, if you rush ahead from the first cocktail to the 6th cocktail, that's something that your friends might eventually stage an intervention about. But if what you do is just work tons, our culture says you're great for doing it. So,
yeah, I've had this debate with some people to bring it to something that has no real consequence. I liken it to the old release schedules for television shows where it was week by week, and then you'd have a long period of absence, and it would come back and it would be week by week, and you'd live with it and sit with it and dialogue with it yourself or with others in between weeks. And then you have Netflix that comes along. And to a certain extent before Netflix, it was, you could get the whole DVD set or Blu-ray set of something, and you could just watch one more right before bed and watch 3, 4, 5 of them. And then it's 2 a.m. It's that kind of binging mentality versus 1 episode per week, each week, and you savor it and you enjoy it more. And I am definitely more towards, well, 1, having grown up that way, but then 2, enjoying it that way now. That's not to say I don't watch 3 20-something minute episodes with my kids when we're sitting down. Right. Like we did that last night and it was great, but then we stopped, and we're till this coming weekend when my daughter's back from college, we'll continue the show that we are watching. And so it's kind of pacing, I guess. Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, I think I've lost the memory of what it was, but there's at least a couple of shows recently where they've sort of, with great fanfare, brought it back, at least in the UK, into dropping them weekly and not dropping them all at once, because I think people do appreciate it. And you have to have someone else in that context. It has to be done to you. You have to, if it's going to be very difficult if all the episodes are there to just develop the self-control to stop. But but it goes back to that, what you were saying is so for example, today, well, for you, it's later because you're in the UK and you're winding down. Me, I've got more day left, but it's to me, how much work is enough work for me today? And that that's the question. And then I have to figure out the answer to that question instead of picking up my phone and then figuring that out. But it's in going back to the word count thing. It's what you were talking about there, essentially.
And right. And this is also, the big point here is that I should have emphasized is that like the goal for what would count as being finished for the day. I wrote a newsletter about this a while ago, drawing on the work of a psychologist called David Maloney. He's got some great YouTube videos about this. Whatever that definition is for what will count as being done for the day, it can't be that you've done all the things that need doing, because that is off the table, right? And so it's got to be something that will leave loose ends, that will leave things unfinished, that will feel in some sense imperfect. That's just a given. So then the question is, what would be the wisest, practical, most ambitious but realistic definition of being done in that sense?
Yeah, in a way, it's a balance between, it's similar to the control and agency. It's closure, and there's a thread there for me that I know to pull on tomorrow. Yeah,
absolutely.
Kind of the best way to put it. So, Oliver, there's so much more we could go into. I don't want to give much more away of the book because I really do think it is worth people going through daily. I will say I think people should do it daily, even if they feel compulsion to go against that. And you have permission from Oliver himself, I guess, to do that. But you're not just doing...
There's a problem here, which is that if I try to control how people read this book, I'm the control freak then, right? And I'm completely violating my own ideas.
Yes. So we give you agency, dear listener, to decide yourself which way is the best. But I highly suggest, and I do think that if you haven't read the first one, this one is a good one to just jump in on. And I know Oliver agrees with me on that. So,
yes.
But Oliver, you're not just writing books, you're doing newsletters, you're doing kind of speaking things here and there, and you've got lots of other things going on, but let's kind of point everybody to where, one, they can find out more about the book, and two, find out more about you, your work, and, connect with you, etc.
Sure. Thank you. Well, for books, please go wherever you normally get your books or audiobooks, which are read by me as well. And then my website, oliverburkeman.com, is where you can sign up for the newsletter and find out about other stuff.
Yeah. Perfect. And again, as usual, I'll list those in the show notes for this episode. And Oliver, great to have you back. And obviously, open door policy. And maybe we don't wait till the next book this time. Although I missed the first one, so I'm kind of trailing behind. So let's just let's do it again at some point in the near future. It would be
nice. I do really enjoy these conversations.
Yeah. So Oliver, thanks for being here, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Eric.
Well, that's another podcast crossed off your listening to-do list. I hope that you enjoyed this follow-up conversation with Oliver Burkeman. In case you missed the first one, I'll list that in the show notes for this episode. You can find that at beyondthetodolist.com. That's also where you can find links to our sponsors, as well as all the tools that I use to make this show, including discounts on most of them. Some really cool tools in there that are going to save you time. And if you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to do me a favor and share it with somebody you know needs to hear it. Hit that share button in your podcast player app of choice, or again, over in the show notes at beyondthetodolist.com. Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next episode.